Hello, my name is Jim Kelly. I'm from Renaissance Christian Church in Vancouver, British Columbia. Today is Mother's Day, and I would like to wish all mothers everywhere a happy Mother's Day. For those of you who your mother is alive, cherish her, enjoy her, support her today, love her today. For those of us whose mothers have passed away, we want to remember them. We want to cherish them. I have a picture beside me of my mother, and she was a beautiful lady. And I'd like to tell you today a little bit about her family history, the family story. Her name was Mariana Jamison. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Jamisons today. Rather than preach a sermon today, I'm going to tell you some family stories. As I started getting into family genealogy, I started to learn a tremendous amount about our family history. My mother passed away in 1993, sadly, and up until that time we really knew very little about her family. We knew that her father, my grandfather, was born in Missouri. We knew that his wife was born in Missouri. Her name was Sarah Ann McCoy. And they had met and married in California, traveled around a lot, and had children in California, then moved back to Missouri, had children there, which is where my grandfather was born. Then they moved to Texas, where my grandfather had a little brother who was born and who was bitten by a diamondback rattlesnake, and sadly died. So they moved back to California then. More children were born there. Now, all that comes into this family story in a very big way, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. When Mom was alive, we knew nothing beyond that. Since then, after getting into genealogy, also getting into DNA, I have learned a tremendous amount about our family history and have learned what a wonderful historic family we actually have descended from. I've been able to trace the family all the way back to the Viking era. And I'm going to read a little bit to you that I have written as a chapter in a book that I'm working on. Perhaps someday it'll actually get published. Who knows? But I'd like to read chapter 1, A Journey Through Time. Who knew that when I set out to compile my family history, that it would turn out to be a 1,000-year saga, which would include ancient civilizations, Viking pirates and Templar knights, and a pre-Columbian journey to the New World. There would be historic churches and wagon trains, saints and sinners, miracles and tragedies. The journey would lead from the ancient Neolithic culture of the Orkney Islands to Ireland and the New World, from Germany to colonial Virginia, from Missouri to Texas to California, from Canada to the Hawaiian Islands, Ethiopia and China, and from Edmonton, Alberta to Vancouver, British Columbia. I started this project so as to document the life of Robert Jamison, whose tragic and yet triumphal story is told in the pages of this manuscript. I also wanted him to know the story of his Jamison roots. The chronicle grew from there, and it is a powerful, interesting, and informative journey through time. I trust that it will capture your fascination as you explore the 1,000 years of Jamison family history. Some aspects of the narrative may be considered as quasi-official, and other parts as legend, because not all can be verified, although there is much anecdotal evidence to suggest that it is generally true. It is also impossible to ancestrally connect all generations. However, it is historically accurate to state that the Jamison family originated in the Clan Gun of the Scottish Highlands, and much has been documented about the clan and their historic roots to the Vikings, so I tried as best I could to connect our family history through the pages of the past millennium. This journey traverses history and legend through a generational pathway of ancestors, and will pass through 20 or more generations until it arrives at my grandparents, my parents, and my life and family. Of course, as I have detailed the more recent history, I'm much more confident in the reliability of my words. To the best of my knowledge, this journey through time and legend is essentially true, and I will believe it until it is proven to be incorrect. And I signed that, James Patrick Kelly, son of a Jamison and descendant of Clan Gun. P.S. I guess that legitimately entitles me to call myself a son of a gun. Okay, add a little humor in there. Anyways, it's been quite fascinating learning all this about our family history. I've learned that the The Jamison family, as I mentioned, descended from the Clan Gun in the Scottish Highlands, and more particularly from Caithness in northern Scotland and from the Orkney Islands. We've descended from a man who was infamous. His name was Sven Aslifson, and he was the last of the great Viking pirates. Yes, one of my grandfathers was a Viking pirate. Well, another of my grandfathers, also going back to the Orkney Islands, was Rognvald, also known as Saint Ronald of Orkney. Yes, he was a canonized saint by the Roman Catholic Church. He built a church. He and his father were responsible for building a church in Orkney, which is currently still standing. It is the last of the great Viking churches of the northern half of the United Kingdom, and it is St. Magnus Church on the island of Orkney. I need to go there to visit it. I have not had that opportunity yet since learning all this information, but that is definitely on my bucket list. However, in this day and age of COVID disease, I guess I won't be going anytime too soon. Very interesting, however, tracing back to those days of the Scottish Highlands. From there, the Jamisons, at least part of the Jamisons, moved to Ireland. And in Ireland, one of my ancestors was named as a sort of a junior knight by the King of England for his work in the Battle of the Boyne. He later moved to the United States. However, while en route to the United States, their ship was attacked by Blackbeard the pirate. And Blackbeard stole my ancestors' treasures that he had received for being made a junior knight by the King of England. So unfortunately, Blackbeard stole my inheritance. Okay, it probably would have never got to me anyways, but Blackbeard stole the inheritance of the family. Well, from there, James Jamison, as he was known, moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, arriving in the year 1710. Lancaster at that time was the largest inland industrial city in the United States, believe it or not. Today, it's the home of the Amish people, or a central location of the Amish people. However, this was long before that. One area in Lancaster is named Little Britain, and it was so named by another of my ancestors, the son of James Jamison, as the town was growing, and they wanted a name for the area, and they decided to call it after their homeland, so they called it Little Britain. Well, another part of the family that I have learned about, didn't know I was part German until I got into genealogy and my family DNA and learned that I am part German. Well, my German family arrived in the United States in the year 1713. They brought the German Lutheran Church with them to North America. That church is in Hobron, Virginia. It's called Hobron Lutheran Church in Virginia, sorry. It's about an hour outside of Washington, D.C., and that church is still there to this day. It's the oldest German Lutheran church in the United States. And again, I claim it as part of my family history. Well, from there, the Jamisons spread out and moved. After the Civil War, they were living in Missouri. I don't know all the circumstances of the Civil War. I see some of my ancestors fought for the South, some of my ancestors fought for the North. But eventually they moved to Missouri, and from there they moved on by wagon train, and they moved to California. And as I mentioned previously, my grandfather was born after the family moved from California back to Missouri. Well, he was born in Missouri, then they moved to Texas. And as I mentioned, his little brother was bit by a diamondback rattler and died there. That's a very important fact, because later on, my grandfather was living in Oregon. He had married Sarah Ann McCoy, who my grandmother, and they were living in Oregon, and it was 1925. My mother had been born along with 4 of her sisters, and they were living in Brookings, Oregon at the time. Well, my grandfather decided it was time to move on. I think we have vagabond in all sides of our family from the appearance, but he decided it was time to move. So he gave my grandmother 2 choices. Well, we can either move to Texas or we can move to Canada. Well, my grandmother said not move to Texas. They got snakes in Texas. She knew the story about the little boy being bit by a diamondback rattler, so she refused to move to Texas. As a result, and a whole lot of other factors that came into this picture, they eventually moved to Alberta, settling near Westlock, Alberta. Now, I think had they known how cold it was on the Canadian prairies, perhaps that decision might have been otherwise. But by the time they got there, it was 1925. There was no money. They couldn't move back to warmer climates. So there they were in Westlock, Alberta, or at least just outside of Westlock. And another 7 children were born there. And from there, by this time now, we're into the Great Depression. And there were no babysitters. The children were the babysitters. By the time they were 12, 13, 14 years old, they were expected to be out working. So it was that my mother, by the time she was maybe 13 years old, was working outside in, I believe it was a pastor's home. She did housekeeping and babysitting for him. That was her job. From there, she moved to various locations, worked in Banff, Alberta for a while, moved to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, worked at the Bessborough Hotel for a period of time, eventually moving to Calgary, Alberta, which is where she met my father, John Joseph Kelly. Now, they lived in Calgary initially. My brother Ron was born in Calgary. And by the way, I will come back further to a part of the story before Ron was born, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. So Ron was born in Calgary, and then the war happened. And so my father was away during most of the war. By the time the war was over, they were living in Vancouver and in a little house. They were living in a little house on Lulu Island, which is now Richmond, BC. Well, Richmond, BC is on Lulu Island, actually. And little Jimmy Kelly, that would be me, I was born in Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster, BC. Well, from there, they lived on Lulu Island for a few years. So growing up, I always heard stories of life on Lulu Island. It sounded very exotic to me. But by the time I was 4 years old, we moved to Alberta and moved to Provost, Alberta, a little town east of Calgary, where my parents ran the bus depot restaurant there. Well, my father was a vagabond as well. So a year in Provost, and he decided it was time to move on. So they moved from there to Fernie, BC. So it was in Fernie that I spent my elementary years. Now, after my father had been in Fernie for about a year, he decided it was time to move on again, but this time my mother refused. She was not going anywhere else. So she stayed in Fernie with Ron and myself, and my father left, not to be seen again for many, many, many years. But my mother raised my brother and myself, and she worked very, very hard. She struggled. Life wasn't easy. She worked in a dry cleaning plant for most of those years. Later on, in 1959, they transferred her to Cranbrook, British Columbia. So we moved to Cranbrook in 1959, and that's where I spent my high school years, was in Cranbrook. Well, Mom continued working there in the dry cleaning plant for many, many years. Eventually married Pete Morawski, and they lived in Cranbrook until they passed away. Mom in 1993, Pete about 9 years later. Now, before Mom's death, about a year before she died, she was up in Edmonton visiting me. And while there, we're driving along out in the country, and she says, "Do you want me to tell you something that's going to knock your socks off?" Well, she never used that terminology. So it was kind of strange, but it was also very strange because before she told me what she was about to tell me, I believe God planted in my mind what she was about to say. She informed me that she had had a son born in 1938, and she had given him up for adoption. I knew very little about his birth. I knew that he had a Chinese father. I knew that he was born in Beulah Home in Edmonton in 1938, and I knew his name was Robert Milton Jamison. It's really all I knew about him. And Mom said after she told me, I said, well, were you surprised? I said, if you'd have told me that 10 minutes before, I would have been absolutely shocked. But somehow, when you said that about knocking my socks off, somehow I knew what you were about to say. She was quite surprised when I said that. And incidentally, growing up, I'd heard about people who had given up children for adoption. I thought, oh, my mother could never have done that. So it never occurred to me to ask that question. So I hadn't asked, and she hadn't said. Well, she informed me about Robert, and he'd been given up for adoption. And I said, well, have you ever considered trying to find him? No, she said, that would be very unfair to the family who adopted him. Well, had she known how that family treated him and what had happened to Robert Milton Jamison, I believe that my mother would have moved heaven and earth to try to help him. Very, very sad story. He was adopted by a family who didn't educate him. By the time he was 9 years old, they took him to China. He said, I don't want to go to China. But they took him and said, oh, we're just going for a little while. Well, that little while ended up being the next 31 years or so. So he grew up in China, worked very hard, basically slave labor for his stepmother and her his grandmother-in-law, or whatever you want to call her. And he worked very, very hard. Well, when he was about 14 years old, I guess it was, he had gone out for a walk this night. Well, he wore shoes. And when he came back, his mother's mother bawled him out for wearing shoes when he went for a walk. And she said, if you don't like it, when he complained, she says, if you don't like it, you can leave. So he decided that night to leave. Well, unfortunately, he got picked up in China for being a vagrant and spent most of the next many years in the juvenile system. Worked in very, very hard places, coal mining factories, rock mining factories. He worked on a sugarcane plantation at one point in time and was accused of stealing sugarcane. He said he hadn't done it, and I believe him. But he was accused of it and ended up spending 6 years in hard labor for stealing a few stalks of sugarcane that he hadn't stolen. Well, it took a long time. He finally was able to get out of the juvenile system after he contacted the Canadian government and asked for help. And they interceded on his behalf, and he was released from the juvenile system in China. It was after that, I guess, that he met Frances, who became his wife. Robert was much lower economic status than Frances. However, her family liked him, and so they allowed them to be married. So they were married, and their son Nelson was born in, I believe, 1979. Well, it was also in that year that Robert bumped into a man who knew the family. And this man said, well, what are you doing here? I thought you were back in Canada, because the family who had adopted him had come back to Canada many, many years earlier, and they had abandoned Robert in China. So this man said, after hearing the story, I will make them bring you back. He said, I'm going back to Canada, and I will make them bring you back. And he did. Maybe he threatened to go to the newspaper. I don't know. But he did make them bring Robert back to Canada. So Robert arrived in Canada in 1979. Took a couple of years for him to manage to bring Frances and Nelson to Canada, but eventually he did. And they ended up settling in Vancouver. Robert bought a house in Richmond, BC. And that's where 2 additional daughters were born and raised, and so the 3 children. Well, I didn't know any of that for many years. After Mom told me, I didn't try to find Robert initially. I thought, well, what do I do? Pete, my stepfather, he doesn't know anything about Robert. Would it be fair to tell him at this point in time? I didn't know. So I didn't do anything for a number of years. Eventually, around 1999 or thereabouts, somebody encouraged me to try and find him. I'd found a family, an adoption match website. And so I eventually put the information on there, maybe 1999 or 2000, I don't remember exactly when. Couldn't have even told you afterwards what the website was, but the response came back, well, you may get a response within a few years, or you may never get a response. Well, 7 years went by. And on October the 24th, 2007, now that date would be very significant because that was my brother Ron's birthday. I'd skipped that part of the story. Ron was killed in a helicopter crash near Cranbrook in 1974. I was devastated. Well, here we are, 2007, on what would have been Ron's birthday, and I get a phone call. Hello, my name is Alice. I'm phoning about Robert Jamison. Now, it didn't even occur to me at that point in time who she was talking about. Had she said Robert Milton Jamison, I would have known immediately. However, she just said Robert Jamison. It didn't dawn on me. His name was indelibly imprinted on my mind as Robert Milton Jamison. So when she said Robert, I just thought, I don't have a cousin Robert. I don't have an uncle Robert. So she must have a wrong number. However, I thought I will phone her and tell her she has a wrong number. So I phoned and we started to chat. And I said, well, what is it you do? Adoption match. Oh my goodness. Are you talking about Robert Milton Jamison? Yes. Information was put on the website yesterday, so the 23rd of October, that matched the information that I had put on about 8 years earlier. I had a brother. Where does your brother live? Richmond, BC. Where do I live? Richmond, BC. Where in Richmond does he live? Blundell Road. Where do I live? Just off Blundell Road. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, don't tell me we live around the corner from each other. Well, not quite, but close. We live about about a mile and a half apart, 2 kilometers apart. So it was, phone calls went back and forth that week to allow for permission to phone. And on the Friday, I was given permission and told I could phone. He was having lunch with his daughter, Elaine, who was breaking the news to him that he had a brother. So we arranged to meet the following day. Well, that day we met in a restaurant in Richmond. I took my Aunt Bonnie along. She was the only one living in Vancouver at that time of my mom's family, of those who were still alive. So I took Aunt Bonnie and I said, Robert, I would like you to meet your mother's sister. Well, needless to say, that was an overwhelming evening, an emotional roller coaster that week. Even the staff in the restaurant said they were practically crying because they'd never had anything like that happen in their restaurant ever. 2 brothers who met for the first time in their lives. Well, we had 10 years together, living close to each other, where I got to know their family. I had the opportunity actually to perform my first wedding, which I performed, was the wedding of Robert's daughter, Elaine. She is the one actually who had put the information on the website on which we were able to match our stories and our history. So I performed her wedding. And then a number of years later, I performed the wedding of her sister, Emily, who was living on Vancouver Island there. So I'm very thrilled that I got to perform both weddings. Nelson had gotten married about 2 weeks before I met them, but he hadn't had a wedding reception. So I got in on the reception. I just missed the wedding. So anyways, after meeting Robert, we had 10 years where I got to know the family and they became part of their family. As I always say to people, yeah, it's amazing to me. I mean, all my original family had passed away, and God gave me a whole new family. The surprising part of it to me is they all speak Chinese. Well, I don't. Except I can say Gung Hei Fat Choi, Happy New Year. That's the extent of my Chinese linguistic skills. Anyways, I tell you all this to say, I believe my mother would have done everything she could have to help Robert had she known what had happened to him. I don't know all the circumstances of why he was given up for adoption. I do know that she was working as a waitress in a restaurant, not making much money. It was the Depression. Plus, I know that there was a lot of pressure on single mothers to give up children for adoption at that time. So I suspect that all of those factors may have come into play here, and Robert was given up for adoption. Sadly, he didn't understand it, why it happened, and I certainly couldn't totally explain it to him, but I was only able to say, Robert, the only thing we can do, we can't change the past, but we can be thankful for what the future brought. We can be thankful that you've got a wonderful family, you've got great kids, they're not drug addicts, they're not criminals, they're great kids. And I have a great family now. I'm very happy about that. And I believe that when Mom got to heaven, perhaps she found out what had happened to Robert. I don't know how things work up there yet. But I believe that perhaps Mom implored God and said, please let my 2 sons meet. I lived in Edmonton. I was originally born in the Vancouver area. Robert was born in Edmonton area. He lived in Vancouver area. So here we are, we switched around, and in 1998, I was transferred to Vancouver and lived in Richmond, which is where my office was at the time. Very thankful for that. So I got transferred here, and I think maybe Mom had something to say about that. I believe that Mom is with God. I believe she's in heaven, and Robert is now too. I trust that, along with Ron. Yeah, it's been a real journey. It's been an amazing story. I have lots more I could tell you, but time has gotten on. It's 25 minutes already. So I'm going to stop this time of history today. And I just say I have done this to pay tribute to my mother, Mariana Jamison, who was a wonderful mother. She worked very, very hard bringing up Ron and myself. And I know she would have for Robert as well. But that's a sad, sad story. But I pay tribute to my mother. Even though my parents were split up, she kept the Kelly family as my family. So growing up, I was close to the Kellys. I was close to the Jamisons as much as I could be, considering we didn't live in the same place as anybody else. But they were all part of my life, and I'm thankful for that. I thank my mom. I thank God for her. And so I just want to say again, Happy Mother's Day to my mother in heaven, and Happy Mother's Day to all mothers out there. Thank you and have a great day. Bye for now.